大家好，谢谢你们来这里听我演讲。对不起，我的中文不太好，那我就讲英文比较好。So, title of my talk is Roundup, the main reason for the health crisis in America. First, a quote: "Those who have the privilege to know have the duty to act." Is this not working? Should I? It's okay? Okay. So here's an outline of my talk. I'll first give an overview of the situation with respect to the toxic chemicals and specifically glyphosate in the environment. Evidence of glyphosate toxicity to human health. I will then, the key highlight of my talk will be the discussion of glyphosate in proteins. The glyphosate getting into proteins by mistake. This is a mechanism of toxicity that we have recently discovered that is very, very significant. I will then talk specifically about autoimmune diseases, which is a consequence of this effect of glyphosate getting into the proteins. And then I'll say a little bit about glyphosate and climate change, because I think climate change is of interest to this group. Finally, I'll talk about how you can protect yourself from glyphosate and your family, and then a summary. So, overview. This is a compilation of the health status in the United States that was done by Zen Honeycutt, who is a friend of mine, a wonderful person and an activist. She has young children, and her children were being damaged by glyphosate, and she recognized that, and now she's become a very outspoken person against Monsanto, trying to raise public awareness of the danger of this chemical glyphosate, which is 加磷酸 一个农药, and it's also called, I think, 绵绵吞. So you know what it is, yeah? So here's some sobering statistics. Of the top 17 most developed countries in the world, the United States ranks dead last in health. And this is despite the fact that we spend so much more on health care than other nations. We've seen a 79% increase in Crohn's disease in children in the past 10 years. 1 out of 2 American males and 1 out of 3 females in America will be expected to get cancer today. Pesticides are linked to a loss of IQ, intelligence. And the American IQ has dropped 7 points since the GMOs, the genetically modified crops, have been introduced. And these crops directly increase the ingestion of neurotoxin, which is in particular glyphosate. The infertility rate has been rising steadily and is now 30% in young couples, the highest in recorded history. Of the top developed countries, the United States is number 1 for infant death on the first day of life. So these are very dismal statistics on our country. Here's some more information about the U.S. health status. We make up only 5% of the world's population, but we consume more than 50% of the pharmaceutical drugs in the world. We spend more on health care than Japan, France, China, UK, Italy, Canada, Brazil, Spain, and Australia altogether. And China alone is a much larger country than ours. So clearly, we're doing something wrong with our health that we require so much money to take care of it. We also suffer from more chronic illnesses than other countries. And the important point is that we consume in the United States 20% of the world's supply of glyphosate. 5% of the population, 20% of the glyphosate. So Roundup, what is glyphosate? This you may recognize. In America, you go down to the local store, you buy this over the counter, you come home, you spray it on your dandelions. Roundup. This is a picture of somebody spraying glyphosate all over the crops. These crops have been engineered so that they don't die. Otherwise, all plants die when they're exposed to glyphosate, except for these crops that have been designed through genetic modification to have a special bacterial gene that provides them with protection from glyphosate. These crops include corn, soy, canola, sugar beets, cotton, tobacco, and alfalfa. So many of these crops are the core crops of the processed food industry, the corn, the soy, the sugar. People are eating many, many processed foods, and these foods are highly contaminated with glyphosate because of this problem. We're also spraying glyphosate on other crops right before the harvest, things like wheat, and I'll get into a little bit more later about gluten intolerance. We have an epidemic in gluten intolerance. People can't eat bread in our country because they're allergic to it. And this, I think, is because of the glyphosate contamination in the wheat. This is the chart that keeps me awake at night. The blue boxes are autism prevalence in the United States. 自闭症, autism. I was very concerned about autism for a long time, and about 9 or 10 years ago I started to look seriously at toxic chemicals in the environment to try to find out which one is causing this epidemic, because we are seeing exponential rise in autism in this country over the past 2 or 3 decades. Very scary. And you can see the red line here. The red line is the use of glyphosate on core crops over the previous 4 years. So this is autism in first grade, 6 years old, and glyphosate over the first 4 years, from the age of 2 to the age of 6 in that child's life. And the two curves are basically coincide, 0.997 correlation coefficient. 1.0 is the best that you can do. Almost perfect match. So when you see this kind of correlation, you have to ask, is there a causal relationship? And that's what I did. And we found a great deal of evidence to support the ways in which the things that glyphosate does to the human health are directly related to the things that are showing up in autism. Very good match. This is some plots of the growth of the GMO Roundup Ready crops, the corn, the soy, and the cotton, going from 1996 on the far left to 2012 on the far right. The green is corn and soy combined. The yellow is soy. Cotton. Oh, cotton is the green. Sorry, the green is cotton. Yellow is soy. Blue is the corn and soy combined, and then the red or purple is the corn. So you can see that at the beginning you have very little, under 15% in 1996. That's when they were first introducing these crops. But by 2012 we have basically 90% of all of these crops are GMO Roundup Ready. So this is a new plot that's come out recently looking at the use of glyphosate versus other herbicides on the crops. And starting at the left in 1998, going to 2011 on the far right. And you can see the red is the glyphosate, which is going steadily up. And the green, the blue, is the other herbicide. So the idea was, back in 1998, this is great. We have this very safe herbicide, glyphosate. We can just forget about all the others, try to really reduce the amount of the other ones that we use by switching over to glyphosate, by virtue of having these special crops that don't die. And so it was true. The blues become smaller, going up to about 2005, 2006, as the reds grow faster. So the glyphosate, more and more glyphosate, less and less of these others, which is supposed to be much more toxic. But now you can see what's happening recently, especially look at 2011, and I'd like to see the numbers after that. More and more of these supposedly more toxic chemicals are now being used because the crops the weeds are developing resistance to the glyphosate. And so you have to use more and more glyphosate. That's why that keeps going up. But eventually they say glyphosate's not enough. We need to add something else. So they're putting back in these other poisons on top of the glyphosate, which is going to be very scary to think about what's coming in the future. So here's an article that showed up in the Newsweek this year. I was very pleased to see this in Newsweek because usually the mainstream journals don't talk about this. They seem to be very much afraid of Monsanto, so people don't talk about it. But Newsweek reported glyphosate usage has increased 50-fold since 1996, when those GMO-resistant crops first appeared. Today, there's 50 times more glyphosate allowed by the EPA, allows 50 times more on the corn than it did in 1996. So as the usage goes up, they just change the limit of what's allowed to keep up with the increased exposure. They never go back and test, is this really safe? They just change the numbers. Half the American farmers' fields have weeds that are resistant to glyphosate today. And now they have, as I said, these new GMO crops. So they're putting in now GMO resistance to other herbicides on top of the resistance to glyphosate. Multiple genes in the GMO crop. Now they can use 2 different poisons on the crop. 2,4-D is a component of Agent Orange that was used in Vietnam. And now they have Endless Duo, a new chemical with both glyphosate and 2,4-D. This is scary. Glyphosate in cotton products. A study was done in Argentina where they tested a whole bunch of cotton products, things like tampons and sterile cotton gauze, and they found glyphosate contamination in 85% of the samples that they tested. In the United States, 96% of the cotton produced was genetically modified to resist glyphosate. So we can be sure that in the United States, these cotton products, and including, for example, Pampers that the children are using, the babies, have glyphosate contamination in them. Okay, so evidence of toxicity. Monsanto assures us that glyphosate is perfectly safe to humans. And the reason is because they claim that there's a pathway in the plants called the shikimate pathway, and that's the pathway that's inhibited by glyphosate. That's how it poisons the plant. And human cells don't have that pathway, and therefore we are safe. This is the argument that Monsanto uses. However, an important consideration is that our gut microbes, our gut bacteria, do have the shikimate pathway, and they use it to produce a product, multiple products that are very important for us. And our cells can't make those things because we don't have that pathway. So we depend upon our microbes to supply us with essential amino acids that have come out of that pathway and the derivatives of those. Other ingredients in Roundup, besides the glyphosate, also are very toxic themselves, and they increase the toxicity of glyphosate to our cells. Now, an important point is that glyphosate is insidious. Its effects accumulate very slowly over time. You don't get a big bellyache when you eat it. You don't feel anything different. But slowly it gets into your tissues and accumulates there and causes damage. So eventually you get some terrible disease as a consequence of a slow accumulation of that poison. The studies are designed to be too short so that you don't notice this. And this is what I think the industry realized. As long as we only look 3 months, we won't see damage. And so they just made a rule. You only have to look 3 months. You don't have to look over the full lifetime of the animal that you're studying. So this is the shikimate pathway, and the important part is up here. Early in the pathway, you get glyphosate disrupting an enzyme called EPSP synthase. And the pathway then has some outputs at the bottom: phenylalanine, tyrosine, tryptophan. Those are the 3 aromatic amino acids. And they're precursors to the neurotransmitters in our body: the serotonin, melatonin, dopamine, thyroid hormone, and also the skin tanning agent melanin, and some other important things like vitamin K and folate are also derived from this pathway. These are B vitamins, important vitamins, are derived from this pathway as well. So all of these things become deficient because our microbes are not making these products for us. Interestingly, if you look at some of the neurological diseases, things that have to do with brain issues such as depression, anxiety, and also alcohol abuse and drug abuse, looking at the top 5 countries that have the most highest incidence of these problems, you find that the top 5 countries are U.S., China, India, Brazil, and Russia, and Indonesia are included in the top 5. And those 4, U.S., China, India, and Brazil, show up in every one of these 3 categories, whereas Russia shows up only for alcohol and drug abuse, and Indonesia has both depression and anxiety. And all of those countries, except for Russia, have very high use of Roundup-ready food, glyphosate-contaminated food in their diet. So the main toxic effects of glyphosate, it disrupts the gut microbes. I've said that already. So because they can't make these, they can't do this shikimate pathway, the microbes themselves get sick as well because they also depend on those nutrients. And so this causes the good bacteria to die, which allows the bad bacteria, the pathogens, to overgrow. And this then causes an immune reaction, and you get inflammatory gut, you get leaky gut, you get a lot of issues with the gut, and that's where the disease starts. It starts with the gut. Glyphosate also interferes with a very important class of enzymes called cytochrome P450 enzymes, also known as CYP enzymes for short. And there are many of these enzymes in the liver, and they play a very important role in detoxifying other toxic chemicals. So when these enzymes are suppressed by glyphosate, everything else in your environment becomes more poisonous than it would otherwise be. Glyphosate also holds on to minerals very, very tightly. Things like iron, cobalt, manganese, tie, gu, mung. So all minerals, not just those three, but many other minerals are affected. And so your body becomes, these minerals become both toxic and deficient at the same time because of the effects of glyphosate. So it interferes with the synthesis of the aromatic amino acids. We said that before, that's the shikimate pathway, and also of the sulfur-containing amino acid, methionine. And then this leads to shortages in the neurotransmitters and folate, as I mentioned before. Importantly, it disrupts sulfate synthesis and sulfate transport. Sulfate is a liosfam, very, very important molecule in the body. And it's actually the molecule that I have focused my studies on. And I believe that sulfate deficiency throughout the body is behind many of the diseases, if not all of the diseases that glyphosate causes. Very big problem with the supply of sulfate. And this leads to disrupted bile flow in the liver and impaired fat digestion and a whole lot of other things. So this was a paper that I read, which was quite interesting because they were looking at the toxicity of various herbicides, and they were going to use Roundup as the one that you would compare the other ones against because it would be the non-toxic one, and they would see reference to that, how bad are the others. And what they found out that was Roundup was the worst one, by far. So they said despite its reputation, Roundup was by far the most toxic among the herbicides and insecticides that were tested. And then they talked about the inconsistency between scientific fact and the industrial claim, which can be attributed to huge economic interests, which have been found to falsify health risk assessments and delay health policy decisions. And I think this is a very serious problem that we face today. The industry managed to convince the regulators 40 years ago that glyphosate was a wonderful chemical because it's so harmless to humans. And that was a lie. And I think Monsanto knew it was a lie even then. I'm sure they know it's a lie now, and yet they refuse to accept the fact that this chemical is toxic. This was a study that was done by Professor Saralini in France with his colleagues. They've done many interesting studies there. And this one in particular drew a lot of attention. They took these rats and they exposed them to a small amount of glyphosate over the entire lifespan, over their entire life. And after 3 months, these rats were doing okay. They weren't any different from the ones that weren't. They couldn't tell any obvious statistically significant difference in their health. After 4 months, they started to show problems. And by the end of their life, they had many issues. The female rats had massive mammary tumors, as shown in these pictures. And the male rats had issues with their liver toxicity, kidney disease. Sex hormones were disrupted in both the males and the females, disruptions of the reproductive system. And they had oxidative stress, which can eventually lead to cancer, showing up everywhere. And as I said, the effects did not become apparent until 4 months. They also had a shortened lifespan. So this is a paper that was done by Nancy Swanson, who's a friend of mine, and some collaborators. She looked at a lot of data in the United States. The United States government has a lot of data about health, the health data that you can plot over time to see which diseases are going up, which ones are going down. And she went through this health data and she found several different diseases. They have over 30 figures in this paper. This paper is open access. You can find it on the web. You can look at the figures yourself. Quite striking because many health conditions that are serious are going up, just like autism, exactly in step with glyphosate usage on core crops. And so I'm just going to show a select few of her pictures from her paper. which are quite striking, and the others are very similar. Here I'm showing thyroid cancer on the left, upper left, diabetes on the upper right, death from dementia, so that's Alzheimer's disease on the lower left, and then urinary bladder cancer on the lower right. You can see the yellow boxes are actually the disease rates in these cases. The red line is glyphosate usage on core crops, and the blue line is the increase in the GMO Roundup Ready crops. So it really looks very striking to me, the matches between the rises in the dramatic rise in all of these diseases and many others that she shows they show in their paper, and the glyphosate. So the question is, how could one chemical cause so many problems? This is the mystery that I set out to solve. And people would say that just can't be true, that one chemical could cause all those diseases. I believe it is true, and I believe I understand why, which we'll get to later on in this talk. So WHO declared glyphosate to be a probable carcinogen last year, and that has stirred up a lot of trouble. All the regulators are now starting to revisit. California actually declared glyphosate a probable carcinogen, and Monsanto immediately sued the state for that, and so they're in litigation right now. The paper by Swanson et al., at the conclusion, they said, although correlation does not necessarily mean causation, when correlation coefficients of over 0.95 with p-value significance levels less than 0.00001 are calculated for a list of diseases that can be directly linked to glyphosate via its known biological effects, it would be imprudent not to consider causation as a possible explanation. Glyphosate in kidney disease, this is actually a very good study that was done by authors from El Salvador. I mean, not El Salvador, Sri Lanka, Sri Lankan authors. And I just met Jaya Samana recently, just last week, at the Monsanto Tribunal in The Hague, Netherlands, which was a very exciting event. He and I were both there, and I had a chance to talk to him in person. He was assigned the task of trying to figure out why the agricultural workers in Sri Lanka were dying at a very young age of kidney failure. And it was a unique kind of kidney failure that they were experiencing without any previous diabetes and the sorts of things that would typically cause kidney failure. So he looked hard at the data, looking at the different regions where they had the kidney failure, where they didn't. And he found very striking that when you had the farmers over where they weren't using any glyphosate, there was no kidney failure. Whereas where they were using a lot of glyphosate, there was lots of kidney failure. So he saw a very strong link to the glyphosate. And he looked at the glyphosate in combination with other things. So they also had arsenic problems in the soil. And then they had nitrates in the drinking water. And he thinks that those three were working together to cause the kidney disease. So that's a very good hint to try to go and understand biologically why would that be. And it turns out to be a very interesting story. And so Sri Lanka took action. The country decided to ban glyphosate usage in the country as a consequence of these studies. So I wish that the United States would take this kind of initiative as well. It's very exciting that Sri Lanka took that decision. And El Salvador is another country that has banned glyphosate. They also had problems with kidney failure among their agricultural workers. Looking at the United States, if you look at kidney disease, you can see very strong correlation. The red line is the glyphosate, and the yellow boxes are the increase in kidney disease in the United States. Extremely strong match. The blue, again, is the GMO Roundup Ready crops. So glyphosate in proteins. This is, I think, the most important slide in this talk. And I want to tell a little bit of a story. I've been looking at glyphosate intensely for about 4 years, and I've been collaborating with Anthony Samsel. We've written several papers together on glyphosate, different mechanisms of toxicity. The last paper that we wrote is on this topic, and we just published that just a couple months ago. It was last December when Anthony gave me a phone call. He said, you know, Stephanie, I think glyphosate is getting into proteins by mistake in place of glycine. Glycine is Seneff, right? Seneff, you guys know glycine? It's an amino acid. So when you build a protein, when your body builds a protein, it puts together amino acids on a string. And it does that with a DNA code. So you come in, this is the schematic here, you see the code for glycine, GGC. the machinery looks for glycine. It finds glyphosate instead because glyphosate looks like glycine. And it says, oh, here's a glycine, let me put that in. And it makes a mistake. Very simple concept. I am almost certain that this is happening. And I also think this explains why glyphosate is causing all these diseases. So it's very, very significant. This is glycine, but the molecule, very simple, is the smallest amino acid. It's got no side chains. This is glyphosate. You can see glycine, glyphosate. There's a glycine molecule hiding inside glyphosate. And that's what can fool the machinery to make a mistake and put the wrong molecule in there, which has tremendous consequences because glyphosate is negatively charged, and it also has this extra stuff sticking off of the nitrogen, this phosphorus over here with oxygen, all that extra stuff. That's going to mess things up for that protein. So here is a schematic of an active site. Many of the proteins have a certain shape for the active site where they fit the substrate into that shape, and then they can do a reaction. So here's your glyphosate instead of glycine. What happens is you've got extra stuff hiding, jamming up inside the active site and messing up the protein so that the substrate can no longer fit in there, and that will break the protein and make it not work. So there's your extra stuff. Now what's interesting to me is that this enzyme that glyphosate disrupts in the plants, in the shikimate pathway, BPSP synthase, that enzyme has an essential glycine at the active site. And that glycine, if you take that glycine out and put alanine instead, you can get rid of any sensitivity to glyphosate. And this is in fact what the microbes are doing. So E. coli, as well as 2 other bacteria, have found a way around glyphosate. They have actually changed their protein so that it no longer has glycine at the active site. And as a consequence, they have resistance to glyphosate. And this is actually the bacterial gene that they put into the GMO crops is like this. It has a missing glycine at the active site. So this is very strong evidence that this is the reason why glyphosate is disrupting this enzyme. So here's some data from a paper on E. coli. And these E. coli mutants that became resistant to glyphosate, you have on the x-axis, you have the glyphosate concentration on a log scale. So you've got 1, 10, 100. So you've got very, very high concentrations of glyphosate on the far right. On the y-axis, you have the activity of the proteins. You can see that glyphosate causes, increasing concentrations of glyphosate cause more and more reduction on the activity of the protein. And that's for the wild type, which has a glycine at position 96 at the active site. Over on the right, you have the mutant, which has alanine instead of glycine. And it is completely insensitive to glyphosate, even at extremely high concentrations. Really remarkable. And these authors remarked on how amazing it was that one change caused such a dramatic change in its response to glyphosate. But they didn't understand, the authors, that this was what was happening. So the world does not understand this. This is why this is so important. Anthony Samsel figured this out. We looked at the data, and it is indisputable to me that this is happening, and that this is the reason why glyphosate is so toxic. So here's some predicted consequences. This is the paper that I mentioned that we published very recently in the Journal of Biological Physics and Chemistry. And I have here a long list of diseases, which hopefully you can read the Chinese, and hopefully it's correct. I'm not sure that it's perfect there, but neurological diseases, autoimmune diseases, chronic fatigue syndrome, which is something that's become an epidemic that we didn't even know existed before. So you have impaired collagen, which causes osteoarthritis and also osteoporosis, osteoarthritis, fatty liver disease, which is also an epidemic. Obesity is an epidemic. Adrenal insufficiency is an epidemic. So all of these things are going up dramatically in our society, and all of them can be explained by specific proteins that have specific strong dependencies on glycine. Very, very interesting. There's a great rich literature on this topic, which we reference in this paper, and the paper goes into great detail about each of these stories, about the different ways in which glyphosate would disrupt specific proteins to cause specific diseases. So impaired iron homeostasis, you get iron deficiency and iron toxicity at the same time, and that's connected to the kidney failure problem. Insulin resistance and diabetes and cancer. All of these things are going up dramatically in the United States today. So as I said, all of these diseases can be linked to specific proteins that have absolutely essential glycines at some place in that protein. Now I just want to say that what we're proposing is not unusual. And in fact, there are many. Glyphosate is not natural. It's never produced by any living organism. It's only produced in the chemistry lab. But there are 4 other non-coding amino acid analogs of coding amino acids that can substitute for other amino acids in the protein synthesis and that cause serious diseases like ALS and multiple sclerosis. So we have BMAA, which substitutes for proline and causes an ALS Parkinsonian-like disease. We have ACE, that's made by sugar beets. It substitutes for serine, and it's associated with multiple sclerosis. Glufosinate is a naturally produced amino acid that substitutes for glutamate and causes a great deal of difficulty with the glutamate problem. Glufosinate is actually an herbicide, and very similar to glyphosate. So it replaces glutamate just as glyphosate replaces glycine. L-cannabinine substitutes for arginine, L-arginine. So the fact that this is happening with all these other non-coding amino acids makes it easy for me to imagine that it would also be happening with glyphosate. This is a very interesting story. It was both a book and a movie. A book was written by John Krakauer. It was a true story about a person named Chris McCandless who wanted to go into the wilderness in Alaska and live on his own off the land. And he ended up dying, and he died of starvation because his metabolic system got ruined by a poison that he was eating that was produced by the seeds of a wild potato plant that he was eating a lot of. So just by eating this wild potato seed, which seemed like an easy thing to get, an easy thing to eat, he killed himself because of this very slow poisoning with this amino acid analog of L-arginine. And so John Krakauer actually did deep research on it and eventually published a paper in a journal describing this whole process. So autoimmune disease, the United States has a huge problem with autoimmune diseases today. The annual direct healthcare costs are estimated to be $100 billion US dollars. At least 23.5 million Americans suffer from one or more autoimmune disease. It's among the top 10 causes of death in women under 64 years old. And the immunosuppressant treatments that are offered have devastating side effects. So you have things like brain fog, muscle pain, rapid heartbeat, abdominal pain, weight gain, weight loss, dry skin, lots of different, just not feeling good, general malaise, lots of issues that are associated with this autoimmune disease. So question, why do we have an epidemic in autoimmune disease in America today? And I believe I have the answer, and this is my answer. So glyphosate, chronic glyphosate exposure, disrupts your gut microbes, weakens your immune system, causes a leaky gut barrier, things leak out of your gut, and a leaky brain barrier, things leak into your brain. Glyphosate contamination in the proteins in your food, such as the wheat, makes them hard to break down. So you're eating wheat, and the gluten actually has glyphosate embedded in the gluten. And that makes it hard for your body to break down the gluten. And with a leaky gut, the gluten gets out into your circulation, and then you get an immune system attack on the gluten, which then, through something called molecular mimicry, causes autoimmune disease. Molecular mimicry meaning that a peptide in that protein resembles a similar peptide in one of your own proteins in your body, some very important protein. And your immune system makes a mistake, and it attacks your own proteins by mistake because it sees this foreign protein that it can't break down. And that's how you get the autoimmune disease. So this explains gluten intolerance, and it also explains many other food allergies, which are, again, an epidemic in America. We have a frightening epidemic in food allergies among children. Peanut allergy is so bad that children can no longer bring peanut butter sandwiches to school because they might kill their child next door who just, by virtue of being close to that peanut, can actually have an allergic reaction. It's quite amazing. They've abandoned having cupcakes at school at birthdays because they're so afraid of something in those cupcakes that might poison one of these children who is sensitive, very sensitive to these foods. People, tremendous problem with gluten intolerance. Huge stacks of gluten-free foods offered at grocery stores these days. Almost any grocery store now has gluten-free sections where you can buy different bread products that don't contain gluten. Egg allergies, peanut allergies, soy protein allergies, corn allergies, milk allergies. Have tremendous problems with migraine headaches as a consequence of some of these sensitivities. All of these foods can be expected to be contaminated with glyphosate given how they're produced. These are foods that we can expect to have very strong, very high levels of glyphosate. So celiac disease is something Anthony and I actually wrote one of our papers specifically on celiac disease. At the time, we didn't know about this amino acid substitution problem, so we probably left out the most important part of the story of celiac disease. This is a chart, a table of plot of the rise in celiac disease. The yellow boxes are celiac disease. The black line is glyphosate usage on wheat. So wheat is not a GMO Roundup ready crop. And so why is glyphosate being used on wheat? What's happening is that they're spraying the wheat with glyphosate just a few days before the harvest. And they're doing that on purpose in order to kill the wheat. If they kill the wheat, it makes it easier for the compound. The plant, there's less residue that gets in the way. And it also synchronizes the harvest so that all the plants go to seed as they die. So you get a slightly greater yield by virtue of doing that. You also, in some cases up north, you're beating a frost. So the farmer's thinking, I may lose my crop because it's going to get cold. I need to harvest it before the frost. And they spray the glyphosate, they harvest the crop. So these all seem like good reasons, and because glyphosate is supposedly harmless to humans, they don't understand why they shouldn't do this. So more and more people are applying this to wheat, also to other crops. Sugarcane in particular, which is of course a major source of sugar, also gets glyphosate right before the harvest. And barley, which goes into things like beer, but there's also various cereals, oats, barley, all these grains are causing then high concentration in those foods. So interestingly enough, there's an enzyme in the gut that breaks down gluten in particular. Gluten is difficult to break down because it has a lot of an amino acid called proline, which is a specifically difficult amino acid to break down. And the enzyme that breaks down proline, first of all, it depends on manganese as a catalyst among. And manganese is one of the minerals that's severely depleted by glyphosate through glyphosate's chelation process, which makes the manganese unavailable. But this protein also contains 3 different regions with highly conserved glycine. So there's lots of opportunity to mess up this enzyme that breaks down the gluten with the glyphosate. And so that's going to be also causing, the gluten will contain glyphosate in it, which makes it hard to break down. And then the glyphosate in this protein, this enzyme, will also make it hard to break down. So the gluten sticks around, and then your body has an immune reaction to it. And the malabsorption can lead to nutritional deficiencies and also to symptoms of autism. So autistic kids tend to have a lot of gluten intolerance. And so I've already said this. Wheat is sprayed with glyphosate, also sugarcane, barley, peanuts, maize, and legumes. So all of these food crops are going to be problematic with glyphosate contamination, even though they're not GMO Roundup ready. Collagen and gelatin. 25% of the protein in our body is collagen. Collagen is what's in your joints and in your bones. It's the glue. It's the glue that kind of holds your body together. 1/4 of all the proteins in your body are collagen. Quite amazing. On top of that, collagen, 1/4 of the amino acids in collagen are glycines. So collagen is loaded with glycine, and a lot of the glycine that's in your body, most of the glycine that's in your body is in collagen. So this means that collagen is very susceptible to damage by glyphosate. If glyphosate gets into the molecule, it will disrupt the triple helix formation. This molecule has very special properties in terms of its elasticity and its strength to hold your body together well, at your joints especially. So you're going to have diseases of the vasculature, the joints, and the bones as a consequence of glyphosate messing up your collagen. Gelatin is a very common food element that's derived from collagen in the bones and the ligaments, that's sourced from cows and pigs. And the cows and pigs are fed huge amounts of glyphosate in their GMO Roundup Ready feed. So we can expect that collagen is going to have high levels of glyphosate. And in fact, Anthony Sempsel sent off a sample of orange jello to be tested, and he found high levels of glyphosate in the orange jello. We're going to report on that in our next paper. So just to think about the gelatin, it's in lots of different food products. There's a picture of jello there on the right. It's also in face creams, various kinds of cosmetics. It's in gel caps, so if you're taking a lot of nutritional supplements, you're eating a lot of gel caps, you're probably getting glyphosate dosages in those gel caps. And most worrisome, it's in the vaccines. Many of the vaccines are live virus grown on gelatin. And Anthony has tested several different vaccines for glyphosate contamination. And he found the highest levels in MMR vaccine, which is a vaccine that people have been very concerned about as potentially causing autism. So this is getting very, very interesting. Very early work now. We're working on a paper on this topic right now. Rheumatoid arthritis. So rheumatoid arthritis is another disease that's going up in the United States. You get a lot of problems with your health when you've got this disease. Inflammation in the joints, pain, limited movement. Your hands, your feet, and your spine are the most affected. So you get a lot of pain in your back. Back pain is a huge problem right now in America. You can develop lung fibrosis. You're going to have an increased risk to atherosclerosis, heart attack, stroke. Iron absorption, again, is going to be a problem. You're going to have what's called anemia of chronic disease. And we have an epidemic worldwide in anemia right now, and I think this is because glyphosate is disrupting the distribution of iron throughout the body. Fatigue, low-grade fever, malaise, morning stiffness, loss of appetite, loss of weight, generally just not feeling good. So we also have an epidemic in use of painkillers in this country. Drug overdose is the leading cause of injury death in the United States. Heroin, morphine, prescription pain relievers. More people died from drug overdoses in 2014 than in any previous year on record. And more than 6 out of 10 involved an opioid drug. More than 650,000 opioid prescriptions are dispensed every day. So many, many people are complaining about back pain, shoulder pain, knee pain, foot pain, in agony I think it's because of the destruction of their joints by the glyphosate. Okay, climate change, my last big topic. This is an interesting plot that shows the various gases and which way they've been going over time, starting back in 1900, going up to 1990. So we need to see what's happening after 1990. It's an early chart. But you can see, interestingly, that sulfate is going down. And this doesn't surprise me because I believe that glyphosate is messing up sulfate severely, as I already said, in the body. So it makes sense to me that it would also be messing it up more generally in the world, reducing the supply of sulfate. Carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is called laughing gas. Those two are very strong greenhouse gases. That's what's causing the global warming. And they're going up dramatically in recent years. So I think glyphosate is a major factor in climate change. I don't know what percentage of the problem, but I suspect it's a large percentage. And I think it's because glyphosate disrupts the ability to hold nitrogen and carbon in the soil. So we have on the earth, you have the grass that grows, all the plants that are growing, and all the microbes that are in the soil, especially the microbes. They're pulling the nitrogen and carbon out of the air, and they're putting them into organic matter. The nitrogen is going into proteins, and the carbon is going into sugars. They're putting all of these things into the soil and keeping it out of the air. Glyphosate messes up those processes. So what happens is that more of the nitrogen and carbon go out into the air and cause greenhouse gases, nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide, to go up, particularly nitrous oxide in the case of glyphosate, I believe. And we've written papers, Anthony and I have described how glyphosate would disrupt the whole nitrogen cycle, both in our body and on the earth. So this is a picture I got from a paper about the nitrogen cycle and antibiotics, claiming that antibiotics would be disrupting the nitrogen cycle and causing more of the nitrogen to get out into the air. Glyphosate has been patented as an antimicrobial agent. This is a plot of nitrous oxide levels over time, going from 1940 to 2010, I guess, or 2005, 2010, I'm not sure. But anyway, going back from 1940, and you can see 1975 is when glyphosate was first introduced into the market. And dramatic rise in the level of nitrous oxide after glyphosate was introduced. I think it's not just a correlation, I think it's a cause and effect relationship. And nitrous oxide is more than 100 times more potent than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas, so I think it's been overlooked. People talk a lot about the carbon dioxide, but nitrous oxide is a very serious problem. This paper, I just wanted to bring out two quotes. This result confirms that the increase in the atmospheric nitrous oxide burden is largely due to nitrogen-based agricultural fertilizer use. And given that nitrous oxide is both a long-lived greenhouse gas and a stratospheric ozone-depleting substance, Toyoung, right? Toyoung. This increase is of global concern. Algae blooms and dead zones, we're having a huge problem in our country around the Great Lakes and also in Florida, and I think in California with algae blooms in lakes due to runoff from farmlands with excess phosphate. The phosphate fertilizers lead to an anaerobic dead zone underneath, so you have this huge growth of these archaea because of excess phosphate, which I think is also a consequence of glyphosate. They're using way too much phosphate and nitrate on these plants because they don't take them up correctly. That the whole nitrogen fixation and phosphorus uptake is disrupted by the glyphosate. So it gets loose and goes into the water. And then you get these massive algae blooms, and then that consumes all the oxygen. And then you get this anaerobic water down below, and that's where the nitrous oxide gets produced. And then the nitrous oxide is released into the air. Very toxic. This was a very enlightening talk by Ben Dobson. Ben Dobson is a great guy. He's a organic farmer. And he's talking about how we can grow corn and soy, and that's what he's doing. He's growing corn and soy crops. Those are two core crops of GMO Roundup Ready crop. He's growing them organically, and he's growing them cost-effectively, organically. And he has some nice quotes from this talk, a TED Talk. Carbon is the skeleton of what's under our feet, and we have been taking that skeleton out of the ground bone by bone and putting it into the atmosphere. Photosynthesis is another word for carbon sequestration. We do farm 40% of the Earth's surface after all, so 40% farming with glyphosate is going to cause a huge increase in carbon dioxide, but if we turn it around, take away the glyphosate, we can not only stop, but reverse climate change by bringing more carbon and more nitrogen back into the soil where it belongs. And these are some pictures from a talk that he gave where he shows on the left, he shows the crop just poking out. The seeds are punctured in by this special device over the matted down cover crop. So the important thing is you grow a cover crop when you're not growing your crop. You plant a crop, so you just plant a crop. You're not even going to use that crop. You're just going to use it to keep the weeds out. And it grows very thick, and then you mash it down and kill it. You don't kill it with chemicals, you just mash it down, and then you puncture your seeds through it, and your crop comes up, and then the mashed down cover crop serves as a kind of herbicide because the other weeds can't grow because there's this mat over the ground. And this works quite effectively, so he shows pictures of his crop, no weeds, and he didn't use any chemicals. So I think this is very, very exciting, and this is the future, and this is what we need to do. We need to find a way to grow food without using toxic chemicals. Otherwise, we're going to have no future. This earth is going to have no future because we're going to destroy it with climate change or poison all the life on earth with chemicals like glyphosate. So how to safeguard yourself and your family? Go organic. This is a picture from our kitchen table, and Victor Zhu and I, we eat, when we're home, we're very, very careful to buy only organic food at the grocery store. And in the U.S., we have certified organic. I think you have that here, certified organic label, where the government has some assurances. You cannot use glyphosate on your crops and call your food product certified organic. Eat foods containing manganese, because manganese is one of the minerals that's severely depleted by glyphosate. These are some examples of manganese-containing foods, very healthy choices. Oysters and seeds and fish and kale, and tea. I know you drink a lot of tea here. It's very healthy food. And bread and beans. Eat foods containing sulfur, seafood, cheese, liver, eggs, onions, garlic, cruciferous vegetables like cabbage and broccoli. That's about it. This is a very interesting article that I found where they are talking about using extracts from common plants such as dandelions, barberry, and burdock. These are basically weeds. They actually have very healthy extracts in them, taoyao, that can protect you from glyphosate, especially if you're taking them before you're exposed. And this was a very interesting article about cows. These cows were sick. They determined that the sick cows had high levels of glyphosate in their urine. And then they treated the cows with some very interesting things. Sauerkraut juice. Is that Doguo San Pai, right? Doguo San Pai, yeah. Activated charcoal, bentonite clay, humic and fulvic acid, which are organic matter from the soil. They have been shown effective in reducing the glyphosate level. So they gave these things to the cows orally, and then the cows were healthier. Their symptoms improved. And then they measured the glyphosate in their urine afterwards, and it was lower. So it looked like that these treatments were working. So in summary, glyphosate is the most damaging chemical in our environment today. We've been grossly misled into believing that it is non-toxic to humans. The strong correlations between glyphosate usage on core crops and the alarming rise in the incidence of a long list of diseases are supported by evidence of harm. Glyphosate's toxicity is easily explained by its biological mechanisms, particularly its potential ability to substitute glycine during protein synthesis. Its effects are insidious and cumulative, and this explains the enormous rise in autoimmune diseases and many other diseases in America today. Glyphosate is likely also a major contributor to climate change. We need to switch to sustainable organic agriculture, and we need to ban glyphosate across the globe. Thank you very much for your time.